Welcome back, everyone, to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. Privileged to have you joining us again. We've got a really, really special guest with us today. Before we get there, just to remind those of you, or not remind, but just to inform those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are the UK's largest pro-marriage organisation. Quite uniquely, we stand for the lifelong exclusive union of one man and one woman. That doesn't mean other things don't take place in a liberal democracy. Clearly they do. All sorts of other relationship types are going on and taking place. But we think that the evidence base says, the long-standing international evidence base, that there's something special about the lifelong union, exclusive union of one man and one woman. It brings something special for adults, for children, and for society. And the evidence is really clear about that. And the reason we're here is to promote that and to make that known much more widely. Now, somebody who's done a lot of work in the area on that is Professor Mark Regnerus. Mark is a well-known author and a professor at University of Texas, specializing in relationship dynamics and sexual behavior. Mark, would you like to say hello to our listeners?
I'm happy to do that, Tony. Greetings to you, and thanks for having me on. As I was saying to you just a bit ago, after a while I move on to the next subject, and so I have to kind of dig it out of my head to think, what did I say in that book? Yeah. So I'll do my best.
Have no fear. I will remind you of all the wonderful things you said in one particular book that I wonder if we could look at. And that's The Future of Christian Marriage, which I think was published in about 2020. From my point of view, a fascinating book, and in its reference to marriage and all sorts of cultural things around marriage. Let's clear this up straight away. The Future of Christian Marriage. We have supporters from all faiths and none, including the Christian faith and many other faiths, but they all tie into that thing I said at the beginning, which is the support of that unique thing, one man and one woman marriage, and its effect on society. Because you looked at maybe 190 different people from 7 different cultures around the world in your book. And what we're not saying is that every marriage should always be perfect, or that every marriage should always work out, because quite clearly sometimes adultery, abuse, abandonment, there are many reasons why a marriage might not work out, but on a population level marriage seems to be a good thing. And so your book, looking at the status of marriage in the Christian community, if you like, was quite profound. And let's start with, if you like, what struck me as the key finding in that book, which is that the concept of marriage has moved from what you might call a foundation stone to a capstone. And I wonder, can you take a couple of minutes just explaining to us what you meant by that?
I didn't invent that notion, but I remember when I read that a while ago, it's like, is that occurring among Christians? Is this sort of like a universal kind of thing? Is this phenomena that I'm seeing, like, I still see some foundational marriages. So you have these two visions, the capstone and the foundation. Foundation, of course, is like on a house, right? It's the thing that the house is built upon. And you think about the house as like the marriage itself. Comparing that to the capstone, which, it's unnecessary, because two people who are successful young adults, like, they don't need marriage to flourish. But it is a symbol of sort of the successful development that you've seen in these two individuals. So this is kind of the notion of the capstone and the foundation. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to sort of, talk to church-going Christians in a lot of different places around the world, mostly focused on those who weren't married and how they thought about marriage and what they were doing to either move towards marriage or if they were just sort of oblivious of it. And I wanted to know, among other things, how much marriage to them felt like, the capstone model. And I figured in the United States, it would be, fairly extensive in terms of that. But I wonder now, is it true elsewhere? Is it true in Mexico, Lebanon, Nigeria, some of the more, a little bit more of the developing world than the US? And
you cover, of course, the data that says marriage rates generally are declining.
Yes.
Although, of course, they seem to be declining in the less well-off parts of the community at a greater rate than they are in the better well-off part, which is
tragedy.
Which is an absolute tragedy, because the people who could most do with the security and the benefits that marriage brings are the least likely to have it these days, which is profoundly sad.
a sign that sort of the foundation marriage really is in retreat, because if you depend upon a foundation, the poor, like they need each other, they need each other's incomes, they need like each other's help, and they're not getting it. And who's getting it is the people who wait and wait and wait and then marry, not really needing it. So they kind of like double what they've got, whereas the poor don't double what they've got, even though they really need to. So I call that in the book, I say, this is, frankly, the social justice issue of our time.
Absolutely. And Carl Trueman cites marriage as being at the heart of the Cultural Revolution, if you like, for similar reasons. But it's interesting. So you describe marriage, you describe marriage as the exchange of resources between two individuals, mainly sexual resources, and that the kind of four components of that you refer to as totality, fidelity, permanence, and with a view to childbearing. And then you talk about the fact that if a spouse is just functional, it makes it raises or reduces the need for a spouse. Do you want to maybe elaborate on that definition and the idea of just a functional spouse for a moment?
I call this the observed model of marriage, not sort of Regnerus's ideal for any reason. But, when you go out and you actually look at what people's marriages work like, you start to see these characteristics. And in the book, I set out to look at Christian marriage. But what I say I found is like, marriage is kind of almost like a universal. And that Christians just still hold on to the vision of it more than non-Christians. Like they're becoming a larger share of it. They care more about it. But when push comes to shove, like the observed aspects of marriage are not radically different inside and outside the church. So as you said, these four kind of traits or characteristics: totality, permanence, fidelity, and expectation of children. These I call the supports for what the sort of the central cell of marriage is, and I call it, it's an exchange of resources between husband and wife in a sexual union. He brings certain things, she brings certain things, and this reminds me of I think it's the old Anglican exchange of vows, right? With my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. Okay, that's a pretty good description of what we're doing, right? When you talk about with my body I thee worship, you're like, what does this work? Well, worship is sort of the affirmation of the worthiness or the worthship of a person. Like, and when you're talking about worth, you're talking about an economic notion, right? With my body, I'm going to help you and do things for you. And with all my worldly goods, again, an economic thing, I'm giving them to you, right? When you take a step back and you look at marriages of people, on average, they're still doing these things. They still intend these things: totality, permanence, fidelity, children. Although the children part is sort of that's the most up for grabs vision of this. Partly because sort of, back to an older book I wrote, Cheap Sex, like the uptake of contraception is so universal now.
When you talk about the reasons for the reduction in marriage rates, so people look at it as something to crown their life with later on when they built all their resources and sown their wild oats and had their fun and everything else like that, as opposed to the thing that they used to build their life on at the beginning.
Right. So in that book, I have this figure, which is basically the modern mating pool, where the older mating pool, sort of everybody was in it who was unmarried, trying to find some partner of some quality, and largely speaking, it was sort of for life, right? It didn't mean that there was no premarital sex. There had been. That's an old thing. However, there was typically more seriousness in a relationship before that happened. And now in the contraceptive era, especially with abortion as a backstop. But even if it's not, I still think, you're talking about two sides of the marriage market. Basically, I should say the mating pool, the marriage market or corner where people get serious about marriage, and the sex market or the sex corners where people are unserious. There's more unserious men than women, which means power flows to women over there. They can be very selective. But over in the marriage side, there's far fewer men who are interested in getting serious at any given time, but more women. Power flows to the men because they can be picky and deceitful and slow and sort of stalling this process towards marriage, which frankly signals part of the reason why we have this capstone. Not because women didn't want to achieve things before marrying, they often do, but because the pace of moving towards marriage is slower. It's on men's timetable, typically, not hers, not universally, but on average. So yeah, the sort of uptake of contraception and that mentality is altered the playing field of the mating market, slowed marriage down, and it became a far more circuitous pathway towards marriage, which also means there are going to be fewer marriages, which I highlight with the capstone model.
One of the reasons you cite as for that change is this concept of cheap sex. And it's interesting because there's a book come out by a UK author, Louise Perry, who's a well-known feminist over here, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. In fact, we've got another video on that book. But again, she highlights the problem with cheap sex and comes to the conclusion, in fact, as a feminist, endorsed by many other feminists in the country, that actually the best thing for women is to get married and stay married, because it's but she highlights the flaws, the trouble, the hookup culture. So tell us a little bit about what you wrote, and it was quite some time ago, and it was one of your most prolific articles, if you like, and shot you to a little bit of notoriety, if I might say, and also attracted a little bit of criticism. So tell us about your cheap sex paper.
Yeah, well, so it started out with an article in Slate magazine back in 2011, but turned into an Oxford book in 2017, which is it travels better than anything I've written, both the idea and the book. When I look at sort of a key portion of the delay in marriage is an obvious function of contraceptive uptake, not just the use of it, but the mentality that comes along with it. And all of a sudden there's this concern that's like, the backstop to contraception is in jeopardy, right? Abortion. Women will probably sort of focus on this sort of abortion pill, etc. Earlier, what they'll do is like, I can't afford to not pay attention anymore. I have to pay close attention, which does sort of highlight, that sex is about fertility.
You're right, and not only that, but just the downside for women of just living in a promiscuous culture. You mentioned another one, and we're looking at the reasons why you highlight in your book. And let's emphasize, you highlight this from the data. This isn't just your opinion or an ideological perspective. You're looking at the data. And another reason you highlight is the fact that women are earning more these days, which in and of itself is a good thing. But because of that, there isn't necessarily the need for a partner. And you also deal with another part of the book, the fact that when statistically now, when a woman is earning more than a man, it increases the likelihood of divorce by 50%. So do you want to deal with that topic?
Just a little bit.
You love controversial topics, don't you?
Yeah, it all floats back to sort of this exchange model. It's not that men don't want to marry, but when they're married, they don't want to take on average. They want to give. Stephen Knock, a sociologist of family, and especially he wrote a book called Marriage in Men's Lives, University of Virginia, defined a man kind of symbolically as someone who gives more than he takes, and basically and produces enough for a surplus. So in the sort of modern capstone model, you have two successful people, and frankly, far more women are graduating college today than men. Women are demonstrating higher degree of success on average than men. But men want to be depended upon in marriage and not vice versa. So when women out earn men, and it's not really a sexist thing to say. I'm reminded of this line from it's a George Clooney movie, Up in the Air, which plenty of people have seen. George and his sort of woman he's having a dalliance with, they're both, in their 40s or so, talking to this 20-something young careerist woman. And the older woman levels with the woman, just let him make more money than you. You don't understand that now, you will later. I personally have no opinion about the subject, but the data seem to. That, men want to provide for women, right? And if they're not doing that, they have to compensate in some other way. And it's not typically, providing for the 1-year-old or the 2-year-old to care. I mean, it causes problems. Even if we can, in our sort of enlightened selves, say it shouldn't cause problems. You can say you shouldn't or you could, but I'm just telling you what it does, okay? It becomes an issue for plenty of couples. Not that she has to sort of completely drop out of the workforce. It's just that it messes with that exchange relationship in a way that's historically difficult for men to navigate.
And that's the data. And we've spoken about fewer men and fewer men in the church, but generally speaking, as you've highlighted, fewer men potentially interested in longer term commitments. If they can get sex without the commitment, well, hey, what's in it for them, if you like? So in that sense, fewer men. One of your points you mentioned in the book, another reason for the decline in marriage is the decline in the interest in what marriage actually is the point you make. So, marriage being that permanent union, by definition, there's a decline in the desire for that. Is that a topic slightly different to, fewer men per se?
That's a separate issue. I pushed back on this, part because, I framed this model because of someone's Gary Becker, the University of Chicago Nobel Prize winning economist, talked about sort of a theory of marriage. So I read it. I'm like, I think this is kind of how it works. But it get plenty of pushback from sociologists, enlightened people that they are. And so they account for the decline in marriage is that, people don't need it, it's outdated, etc. But that's addressing why people aren't marrying at the rate there. How does it look when they are married, right? And so, if you keep this capstone vision alive through your marriage, that means, you're more likely to move to opposite sides of the country for work, have a commuter marriage, no children. The permanence, of course, is an open question. We'll do this as long as our love shall last. And you'll hear talk of open marriages, typically not from women, more apt to be broached by men, especially if you're not living proximate to each other. It's an odd woman, I would say, who expects her husband to be faithful to her, and he doesn't live anywhere near her 9 or 10 months out of the year, right? That's just, back to what people are like, right? They don't function that way. Men are not good that way. So this idea of what marriage really is, people want this, they want to be able to create it however they please. And I'm saying, you're welcome to try. When I stare at what people are like in the quantitative data, sitting down with them in interviews, watching how marriages actually function, it tacks in the direction of this Beckerian theory of marriage for Christians as well as non-Christians, right?
And that touches on your last reason, if you like, that you mentioned in the book as to why marriages are declining. And that's that people are bringing the market. You say people are bringing the market into their bedrooms and into their affections in an increasing way. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that means?
That idea that we've kind of created this free market in relationships, which is entirely true, is toxic to how marriages actually function. So there's a definite distinction between, like, how do I find a spouse and what is my behavior going to be like within the marriage? What's the marriage going to be like, right? We have this free market adjustments in looking for a spouse online, etc. And if it was so efficient, we should be creating more of them earlier, but clearly it's not efficient. Why is it not efficient? It's a very efficient way of cycling through people and profiles, but it doesn't help you become married in the sense of, like, and also to demonstrate marital qualities, right? Mm-hmm. Because once you're married, you have to rely on a completely different set of principles, and you kind of want to, but you've already trained yourself to sort of be free market about this thing, right? So you have to turn the app mentality off, right? Because once you're married, this is an entirely different ball game. So I talk a little bit about the book, that the free market doesn't know where to stop, right? When we welcome the free market into our household, and we do, we should not be surprised when it wants to colonize all rooms in the house, including the bedroom. Marriage isn't sacred from a market mentality.
It's not going to stop. You have to stop it. That's absolutely right. And you mentioned that marriage hasn't changed, or the nature of marriage certainly hasn't changed. So given marriage is what it is in the way we're looking at it, you asked the question, can marriage survive? And then you make the interesting point that marriage is not about love. And of course, we're dominated by the catchphrase, love is love. But you say marriage is not about love. Marriage is for people who want to add to love what marriage is. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about, because that just smacked me right in the head, because I thought that's fantastic. Marriage is for people who are in love but want to add to their love the thing that marriage brings. Tell us a little bit about that.
You think about a couple who falls in love. There's this impulse, like, well, what if we got married? Why don't we marry? What are they hinting at here? They want to buy in, basically, to what marriage is, which is a different question than the reality of their love, right? So when we think about, like, is marriage fundamentally the love relationship between two people? No. I mean, like, lots of people can love. 17-year-olds can love each other. Like, they feel this emotion between two people. But what is it that you are adding to your relationship when you express love for someone? It's what marriage actually is. Most people today seem to think, like, oh, we love each other, let's marry, and, like, we'll work out what we want to do in that marriage. We'll construct our own vows. We'll make this marriage. They overestimate how that's going to how well that's going to work. Marriage over time and history, etc., as I've described it, like, people are, when they marry, that they're signing on to that. And if you think about this both the exchange relationship as well as the supports to it, okay, that's what people want. They long for permanence. They long for fidelity. Even if they don't accomplish it, they want it, right? And we want it for them. One of the sort of sad things, I think, watching sort of the rise of same-sex marriage, this emphasis on love and erotic love, especially when people look at gay men's marriages, there's already this tacit understanding that there'll be infidelities, such that we think, oh, gay men have a different understanding of fidelity. It's like it's psychological fidelity, not sexual fidelity.
Yeah.
But the fact that women tend to be more key supporters of same-sex marriage than men are, they look at this vision of marriage and they sort of give gay men a pass, thinking, oh, they don't think about it like we do. How women think about it is central to what it actually is. So I talk about in the book, it's like, well, a cohabiting man and woman can add to this what marriage is by giving up this vision of like, we don't have to be permanent, children, meh. Like, you want those things. But what we can't, I'd say, it's not even allow or endorse, it's because it's impossible, really. It's like for there to be an exchange relationship between a man and a woman, between two men or two women in a sexual union, because children aren't even possible, right? In that they have to go outside of the relationship to acquire them.
This is the data that speaks to this. This isn't you and your opinion or your ideology. This is the data, which is very clear. And you've got other people like Walter Shum and his book on same-sex parenting research highlighting the data, which is very, very clear about these things that you're saying. It's not an opinion. It's not an ideological perspective. It seems to be the fact.
At the core of it is something that two men and two women want to have, but the best they can do is mimic it. One of the things I say in elsewhere is one of the problems with same-sex marriage is that it's frankly, unfair to men and women. People see it that way, but it's unfair because two men both have typically as a provider mentality. Like, it's no wonder that in the United States, same-sex marriages among men, they report to the Department of Treasury unbelievably high sort of incomes because they have taken the provider mentality, doubled it, and often outsourced care. Even when you see discussions about like, well, we don't have a mother in this union, like, but we're going to make up for it as best we can. Dave Rubin said this to Jordan Peterson.
Well, I watched that interview. That was quite interesting.
And
another
I'm thinking,
whole discussion, that interview is
right. What they're talking about is like the mimicry of marriage, not the marriage itself. Anyways,
and
for another time.
Katie Faust has a lot to say about that as well in her book, Then Before Us, which brings a lot of, and I would recommend anyone who's interested in the subject, go away and read Katie's book, because that deals with the data very, very comprehensively. I thought we could come on to, in a minute, because what I really loved about your book was that it deals with, or it gives suggestions as to what we might do, which were really healthy suggestions. But I just wanted to pick up one or two other things you mentioned in the book that are worth mentioning and not missing out. First of all, you talk about the negative effect of social media on a marriage, potentially. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
It's one of those things where, like, it's very easy to get into. And, our household, we have the same issues with social media, or even just media in general, that it pulls, the union between man and woman is like, it's meant to be this kind of unmediated thing, not always face to face, but like we're together. So when we're starting out getting to know people by way of media, it's one of those things where we're apt to miss things. I think about the use of dating apps, etc. People will swipe right and left, and they'll basically reject people that they potentially wouldn't reject if they had met them in person. You don't know how this person sounds. You don't know the sort of dynamics between. Like, oh, I didn't notice about this about him. It signals the importance of how we look, the signaling of class status. It's not about like, well, how are we going to get along, right? My wife tells me, get off your phone, right? It's good advice. And I could say, oh, it's the means by doing business today, but like, she's right. I do need unmediated communication with her and her with me.
And that's it's so personal note, if you like. We've got our 27th wedding anniversary coming up in a couple of days, and one thing I've discovered is that successful marriage is based on mutual, unique experiences together, and social media takes away from that because it's very demanding, it's very addictive, and it's just you and the social media. And actually, a healthy marriage, the healthier the marriage, the more kind of personal interactions you have unique to the two of you. And that's really what we're finding that's the thing that really builds, kind of fortifies the walls, if you like, of our marriage.
Right.
Is just doing things together, just the two of us, that are unique to the two of us.
Back to that center of marriage, it's an exchange. And the exchange isn't just sort of like, oh, I'm going to go to work today and make the money. Like, exchange is sort of interactive, right? It's so it blossoms and flourishes in real present.
Yeah. And even, the kids come back after university doing this, that, and the other, and a very busy house and all sorts of things. You've still got to find that time, which is just you two, because that's what it's built on, just the two of you, which is fantastic. And you also mention the lovely phrase, you remind us of Aristotle's phrase that the state and the economy is there for the family and not vice versa, which again is fundamentally, tell us what you mean by that, because that's fundamental.
You look around the world, and especially in 20th century history, we've had two profound errors. One is when the state thinks people are for serving their purposes. And the other is then where the economy is, we're supposed to bow down and serve the economy. So both the sort of unfettered free market and the centralized planning, those both get it wrong, because the fundamental cell of society is the family. And what can we do to help them flourish better? Whereas, I see in the United States, we have bowed down to the economy. At least we got the central planning thing. We saw the evils in that. At the same time, we now sort of think of this fundamental cell of society as the individual, not to the family. And so even, if talking about like a living wage or a family wage that church used to talk about, it falls on deaf ears. It's foreign language to think we have to think about what it takes for a family to make it.
That the family is the building block of a civil society. Strong families don't need big governments. They can get on with it themselves. That's the whole point, which interestingly is why you get so many organizations that are radical organizations are interested in, quote, the destruction of the family. Because while you've got strong families, you don't need big governments, and families pass things on from generation to generation. And you've got to disrupt that if you want to disrupt society. So, yeah, absolutely right. And the last thing I wanted to mention before we go on to the things that you recommend we should do, you talk about the gender revolution and overreach. And you're saying, and I agreed with you as soon as I read that actually it's something which will deal with itself in time because it is overreach. Tell us a little bit about what you meant when you said that.
This idea of both the radical equality of men and women, and that it's somehow a good to think of men and women as sort of almost sexless or genderless, and sort of the kind of overreach that we see going on today, especially in the UK and Her Majesty's colonies, this idea of the nature of gender identity, gender medicine for youth, adults, the idea that we could become the opposite sex. These seem to be overreaches to me. They have gotten farther, perhaps, than I thought they ever could, partly because the foundation for them was laid intellectually a long time ago. At the same time, lies do tend to fall apart eventually, but a lot of damage can be done to a lot of people by the time that occurs. When I think about my family as a natural institution, it's not going to go away. Marriage is not going to go away. People will tack in that direction because it's natural to.
Yeah.
Whereas the idea of altering one's sex is not that kind of idea. It will eventually fade. So one of the things I think is going on in Central and Eastern Europe is that when I see going on is where there's still debates about the meaning of marriage and the sort of the boundaries of marriage. You're starting to see among them, this discussion about is marriage alterable is followed fairly tightly in time by a discussion of whether human sex is alterable. And so it looks more like a package deal to some nations and some peoples than it might have, just a decade ago. So,
well, you say that. I mean, if you look at the model in Soviet Russia, around the time that they wanted to destroy the family units, 3 key principles: trivialize sex, so sex becomes meaningless; confuse gender roles, so remove them from society; and remove the nature of long-term relationships, no-fault divorce, for example.
Yeah.
So there's nothing new under the sun, as they say. It's the same old model doing the same old thing.
Americans were surprised that they didn't have the first sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s. You have to look back to the 20s and see what a disaster it was.
It didn't end well in Soviet Russia, did it? Soviet Russia and Maoist China, different estimates, but around about 100 million people ended up dead. Not a good thing. It's not through war. That's killed by the state. Not a great way to carry on society. But let's move on to what we can do, the positive things about what we can do to hopefully promote marriage, to kind of regain some things. First thing you mention is exemplary stories. Right. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, sometimes you'll hear this, like, there's no good family sitcoms on television that have competent fathers and healthy families. That's one thing. But in general, we're not talking enough about healthy marriages and successful marriages. I mean, so you want your children to see it, but if your children didn't see it, or if you didn't see it, you have to see it somewhere. You have to hear about it somewhere. So in the interviews I did, I was looking for what are some healthy things that I see going on? And a number of people kept referring to when they heard examples or they saw examples or they had families that they were just drawn to, that keeps this narrative of hope alive in some people. Social media, it's not quite the same because we have this sort of polished vision of marriage, and then it breaks down and you're like, what the heck? What happened there? We just need to see it in action and hear about it in action.
And there's 2 things there. So I had somebody come up to me in the street the other day, bizarrely, and say, how nice to see a middle-aged couple holding hands walking down the street. And you think, well, why wouldn't we hold hands? We love each other. It's like, why wouldn't we do that? And another thing, because, of course, a lot of this comes out of Hollywood. And that's a whole other conversation in and of itself. But I actually found myself giving some money to Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire Plus service, whatever it was, the other day. Not advertising it at all, but just, to kind of complement things with the other side of the story. And as opposed to Disney saying we want 50% of our kids' characters to be LGBT, where on earth does that come from, and how does that reflect society? Somebody's got to do the other thing, if you like. So those exemplary stories, very good piece of advice.
Yeah, it's frustrating when you think about it. People on the left tend to think the culture wars are conservatives upset about inevitable social change. Frankly, we're just trying to preserve things that are fundamental goods. And we didn't start that battle.
And we're having a big discussion. It's getting increasingly loud in our country about what kids are being taught in schools. Because, some of it, well, I know you're having the same. We don't have the kind of school board scenario that you have in the US. So it's not quite so ranty, typically British discussion.
One good aspect of the free market in education in the United States is that you can take your business elsewhere.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah, but it's not quite the same case. Unless you've got a lot of money, it's not quite the same in the UK. Another thing that you mentioned, because I recognize you're a busy guy, is to reclaim a marriage-friendly culture or marriage-friendly cultures. Any idea what you meant give us a couple of examples on how we
Yeah.
reclaim marriage-friendly cultures.
Right. And this is typically speaking where you see, since the book is about Christian marriage, uh, the organizations in the Christian world of a certain size that can help sort of animate a community around the idea of marriage as a sustainable good. So in the United States, you have you have mega churches. That's not really it can be a marriage friendly subculture in the fact as far as the pastor saying nice things about it. But like people don't really can meet each other there. It's got to be at this sort of level that's bigger than a small group, smaller than a mega church.
Yep.
Groups that can foster a subculture among 40, 60, 80, 100, 120 people, where there's a respect for marriage and a opportunity for young adults to meet, really. But the point isn't to meet for that purpose. The point isn't marriage. The point is something else. Typically speaking, it's sort of religious in nature, right? If you're gathering for worship or instruction or something like that, and you see it's a good place for meeting, and these are people who value marriage. That kind of creates this sort of subculture among a group of people. And I think that those are kind of important to foster.
Yep, very good. And you talk about making the home a haven.
Right.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this is a little bit about that sort of get the market mentality out of the house, right? We already, the world is tough enough to navigate economically, educationally, etc. Don't bring it home. Make the home a place where there are sort of some sacreds that don't occur there, right? I'm not saying, dump your phone at the front door, but like the home has to be a culture apart from that, right? This is where we talk. This is where we gather, right? I talk a little bit about the importance of the dinner table there.
Well, it's similar. I think it's Josh Hawley's point in The Tyranny of Big Tech. He's talking about the tyranny of big tech, and then suddenly says, well, actually, you need to have dinner together at home. It's a really good family thing to do. And it's profound, isn't it?
Single most important thing in our household.
Yeah. Just sitting down and having food together. You talk about preparing people for marriage. You talk about helping navigate challenges in marriage. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Marriage prep has been kind of modest in its quality, I'd say, for quite a while, in part because, people just got married. They'd figure it out, etc. They'd watch other people. But now in an era where marriage is becoming not a minority practice, but it's moving in this direction, we have got to help train people on what it is and how to stay married, etc. So effective preparation is improving, but it's also very important. We also think about once people are in marriages, some are going to be better than others. Some people are better at it, but also some marriages are more peaceful than others. We need to sort of support people who are in tougher marriages. We all know people like this. What we don't want to do is sort of dangle in front of them some ideal all the time, but we need to walk alongside them, help keep them in it. And people can actually improve their marriages. Marriages go through ups and downs, and I talk about the good enough marriage and how to help make that happen.
And marriage is tough. It absolutely is tough. It's hard work, but that's kind of the point of marriage, because, my wife and I are different people than the people we would have been had we not married, because we've changed each other. And sometimes that's been a really abrasive process, but it's good. We're better because of it.
Rubs off the tough edges.
Absolutely. And you can tell, not that I'm, people who've chosen to live on their own, that's absolutely fine. But, you can tell sometimes, and this is a little bit controversial, when you come across people who have never had somebody in their lives kind of, highlighting those rough edges. When you say this, people get really offended, and thank goodness for my wife saying that to me, because it has saved me from an awful lot of trouble, which I otherwise would have got into.
Yes.
So now, before we get into more trouble, let's move on. You mentioned kids leaving home for the right reasons. It's absolutely right. There is that I remind everyone that our supporters come from all faiths and none, but there's that biblical notion, for this reason shall a man leave his father and mother, and and the idea that there's nothing wrong. I think this failure to launch thing in America, which I think where that phrase has come from, unless you're out the house by 18, there's been some kind of systemic failure. I don't think is necessarily the case.
No, that's a product of America's sort of thirst for the free market. So I think it's important. We're not done maturing by 18 or 22. And so I've noticed, like, when your kids go away to college, like, get away from the parents, but they value your opinion over time more. And so, when our son came back at 22, probably for 2 years or so, he valued our opinion more than he used to. And so if he was out on his own somewhere, 1,000 miles away, he wouldn't get that opinion nearly so often, right?
Yeah. And you mentioned, and again, that's kind of an effect of the state changing perceptions around that. But you also mentioned prudent intervention by the states. And
yeah.
Tell us what is prudent intervention?
Probably the diciest advice I give, and it's the most uncertain advice I give, and I state that. But I suggest the experimentation with prudent, targeted state investment with marriage. But as I begin that section saying, states are much better at harming marriage than helping it.
Well, evidently.
So that's why, you experiment with it. I think since sort of the marriage is at its core an exchange relationship, any sort of state targeting is probably going to be around subsidies and things like this, right? You see, I give the example of Poland's, I think it's called 500 plus. That's for children, right? And it's very difficult for states now today to endorse marriage so much that they give you money for it. In the United States, you still have sort of the marriage penalty in taxation, which is very frustrating. But states that rightly understand their place in human society will recognize that we want thriving families and marriages and seek to bless them that way. But far more often, we look around like, oh, families are great, but therefore, let's turn our attention to people who don't have families and figure out how to help these people who are single, poor, etc.
Hungary is a very good example of. Hungary have had a problem. I mean, you've got a replacement rate, huge problem in the US. Replacement rate being, you need 2.4 children per couple in order to replace your society, and you're at about sub 1.7, I think, something
We're
crazy
now,
like that.
Around 1.7, which happened rather quickly. I mean, usually we were floating around 2.1, 2.0, and now we've kind of gone the way of Europe.
And we're the same in the UK, but you've got countries like Hungary who have seen this and have tried to head it off with marriage policies, because they said, well, actually, the best version of the next generation of society comes through healthy marriages. So we're going to introduce policies which promote marriage and promote childbearing. And it's had empirically, in spite of the reaction from some of the overlords in the EU, empirically it's had a very positive impact for Hungary. And so, that's been great. That's the way a state can. Although I agree with those who say actually the state should get out of family life altogether,
Yeah, I understand that mentality, and that's come to bear in sort of church-state squabbles over sort of the meaning and oversight of marriage itself. And yet, as you just said, the state depends on healthy families. Healthy families depend on marriage. So there is probably always going to be some degree of state regulation of this. So it's important to get it right.
So, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. We talk an awful lot in our country about more police officers on the streets. And you think, well, the evidence says that if you got more fathers to stay at home, that's going to deal with the causes of crime much more than police officers to mop it up afterwards,
At some level, it's a recognition that we've screwed this up so much so that we can't get our way back there. So let's figure out
Yeah,
How do
yeah.
we put band-aids on this?
Exactly. But love is love. Who loves who? Who likes who?
Yeah.
What's that got to do with the state, quite frankly?
Love is sacrificial.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Another thing you highlight is because essentially your book is the future of Christian marriage, although you've quite accurately said it impacts on a lot more because it's a microcosm of marriage per se. You talk about poor teaching in the churches, and the Church of England's discussion. Lots of other churches, national denominations are more likely to embrace same-sex marriage. We had an announcement recently by the Church of England that the definition of a woman isn't quite as easy as it used to be, etc., etc. Complete nonsense. And you make the point that poor teaching in the church is kind of one of the reasons why we've got to where we've got to, and really is one of the ways out of where we've got to. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that?
Pastors of all Christian denominations have a lengthy history of ample interpretation of texts here about what marriage actually is and how it functions. To sort of cower in the face of a bit of pushback from people outside the church is just unconscionable here. It's very frustrating. I was at a mega church in Colorado where, they just didn't want to talk about this because they were afraid of alienating some of their base. And like, this is madness, right? So it's one of those things where, yeah, they're afraid of losing their authority. Like that, this is not the way to reacquire some cultural authority, is by sort of bowing to the modern shibboleth. It's marriage is what it is. Either you endorse it and seek to bolster it, and the church has plenty of resources to do so, theologically, intellectually, educationally, practically, or you're going to miss the opportunity because marriage is a natural institution. It will right itself over time. Do you want to be part of that process, or do you want to be mistaken and regretful for having, endorsed the spirit of the age?
Yeah. Do you want to lead the culture, or do you want to follow the culture? And the two things go in different directions, really. I think that's one of the things. You talk also in your book, finally, moral communities theory and the idea of the corrosiveness of cohabitation. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is back to the idea of like what goes on around you matters a great deal. This was a debate that happened in sociology of religion, I don't know, several decades ago, about sort of the nature and of crime, and is it that does what happens around you affect your ability to behave well, or can you behave well just by sort of sheer goodwill and your own set of beliefs, etc. I applied that to this a little bit, and it's like, is it the case that we can have these pockets of Christians here and there who have a clear vision of marriage and they can thrive? That's sort of the embattled but thriving theory. Or kind of opposed to that is like, does the Christian church really benefit from surrounding culture endorsing basically what it believes about meaning of marriage and family? And the evidence to me suggests like the embattled but thriving theory is tough, and because there's so many ways in which sort of the educational pipeline is leaky, and by the time your children are adults, like they have seen, heard, etc., so many different competing cultural narratives around marriage that they're no longer embattled. They've largely endorsed the spirit of the age. So moral communities theory seems to suggest, and it's a good interpretive lens for what I'm seeing out there, is like, when those outside the church, in the world, etc., are doing things with regard to marriage and family that reinforce what the church thinks and is constant with, that's sort of a far more apt to be the case for the Christian church than to think that they will successfully sort of be swamped by the culture and yet still be able to muscle their way out. I don't see a lot of evidence for that. I mean, the world creeps in a lot more than they are sort of prophetic towards that world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Mark, I want all our listeners to go and get this book if they can, and to read it, or it's available on Audible. They can listen to it. I think it's on Kindle as well, because you deal with these matters much more comprehensively in the book than we're able to in a brief conversation. But thank you, first of all, for having the commitment to look at this sort of stuff from an evidence base. Thank you also for taking what must be, the hard personal decision to look at some of these areas, because it's not popular, and you do get vilified, and you do get a lot of pushback, and people often don't deal with the arguments. They move straight to ad hominem because the arguments from the data simply aren't there. So they have to go for ad hominem. Thank you for doing that. There are people like you who are standing for what matters in the culture, and this is not meant to be offensive to anybody, but clearly there are some things that work out better for society than others, and a government ought to be promoting those things for the general population while accepting the fact that other things may take place in a liberal democracy. Fine. Thank you for doing that. Can you just tell us what you're working on next? What's going on now?
What's going on? Working on a book tentatively entitled The Dirty Science, it's a little bit more of a biographical look back about the science of sexual and gender identity, and how, and partly about my own participation in it, but sort of how the entire sort of scientific enterprise has been sort of ideologically captured such that it becomes very difficult to say some of these things. I published my books at Oxford, and people would pull their hair out, like, how does Oxford keep letting this guy spout such untruths? Like, well, because some of them still have a commitment to sort of understanding the world as it is. So next book is about sort of
academic
the kind
integrity,
of captivity of science, basically.
Yeah. Well, that sounds really interesting. Look forward to reading that. You are one of those people, along with various other people that we've interviewed recently, who are moving the needle in a positive direction. You're
I hope so.
Denting,
Sometimes I wonder.
Putting a dent in the universe. No, you are, Mark. And can I just encourage you on behalf of the tens of thousands of people who are our supporters, please carry on, because what you're doing is good, and what you're doing makes sense. So please, all power to your elbow, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it.